I'm pleased to introduce today, I think some of you know him, Dr. Joseph Prabhu, who's been a professor of philosophy and religion at Cal State University, Long Beach. He's both a scholar and a peace activist, and is the author of Ramon Panikar as a Modern Spiritual Master and the editor of Intercultural Challenge of Ramon Panikar and the two-volume Indian Ethics, Classical Traditions, and Contemporary Challenges. Having recently retired from teaching, he's got 3 books in progress: Liberating Gandhi, Community, Empire, and a Culture of Peace, which should be out in 2018, as well as Hegel, India, and the Dark Face of Modernity, and Human Rights in Cross-Cultural Perspective, both of which we can expect in 2019, I hope, right?
Okay.
We always hope.
Yeah, there's always hope, yeah.
He's been a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard University and the Mary Marty Center at the University of Chicago. He's the past president of the International Society for Asian and Comparative Philosophy and the program chair for the Melbourne Parliament of World Religions. Among his many awards are the Outstanding Professor Award at CSULA, the Lifetime Achievement Award from Soka USA, and official commendations from both the Southern California Committee of the Parliament of the World's Religions and the Mayor of Los Angeles for his contributions to interfaith dialogue and civic harmony here in the Southland. He's got a remarkable intellectual biography, which could be a presentation in its own right, but just a couple of things I've gleaned from my interaction with him. He was Mother Teresa's first altar boy. He also studied economics under Amartya Sen, Nobel Prize winner, and philosophy under Bernard Williams. So he's got and those are just a couple of tidbits of a longer intellectual itinerary. In 2016, California State University, Los Angeles honored him with an annual endowed lecture series in his name called the Joseph Prabhu Fund for Interfaith Peace and Justice. Please join me in welcoming
Thank you all for coming. What Brian failed in his modesty to mention is that he was the lecturer in this Joseph Prabhu Fund last year, and it was my colleagues to this day, Brian, still talk about that and the subsequent dinner that we had. So again, let me thank you in public as I've thanked you in private. And let me say to all of you that it is a great pleasure to be here. I don't say that conventionally. I'll tell you why. I moved to Los Angeles from Boston, same place where Brian moved, though we were at different universities. I got my PhD at Boston University. But when I first came to Los Angeles in 1979, I lived in Venice, and Loyola was, in a sense, my home away from home, because I was sort of trained by the Jesuits in India, and this was a Jesuit university, and I spent time at Fordham in New York, so I gravitated here, and there was a remarkable community. I mean, Chris Chappell, who will be joining us shortly, had not come as yet, but it's been a source of great pleasure and joy to me to see this university grow. It was a far smaller campus then. I think you probably in '79 had about 4,500 students, and it's sort of grown in very encouraging ways. I'm also very pleased to be in this particular space, and of course I could spend a whole seminar looking and giving you interpretations of Edith Stein, but on this occasion I wanted to pick up 2 that sort of sit well with my talk. One is this wonderful line from Scott Cameron, we exist in a living dialogue with nature, and the other is by the renowned Pythagoras, the mind is not a vessel to be filled, it is a fire to be kindled. As I say, between Pythagoras and Scott Cameron, you can't really go wrong. So I want to get straight. By the way, Emilio, is there a flyer that is? Oh, everyone has that. So because I'm going to be covering quite a lot of ground, I think it's probably better if you sort of follow along. I'm one of these dinosaurs where if I had done things properly, there'd be a PowerPoint, and you could sort of I could be pointing an arrow and all kinds of colorful effects. But lacking that, you're going to have compassion on this dinosaur who's going to make you follow along on a sheet of paper. I'm going to skip, because of lack of time, the remarks about the Protestant Reformation. As some of you know, on October 31st was the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. And the only thing that I'm really going to pick up is my sort of twist on that, which is that education, and that links up with the sort of sentiment of Pythagoras, there is always a reforming of structures of thought, structures of sensibility, because the mind, when it's kindled, is forever active. And in that sense, what I take from this great historical event is a philosophical point, namely the reforming and the revisioning of older realities. Let me come to point number 2 and straight to the intent of this. It's not quite a lecture, it's really, as I will make clear, more of a symposium, where I want to put some ideas before you, and then in the conversation that will follow, for which I will leave plenty of time, we can perhaps go deeper. But let me say 2 things by way of introduction and stage setting. One is that in calling this talk Towards an Ecological Civilization, I'm really trying to push environmental thinking beyond its very interesting developments now in various areas of ecology, our human place in nature, to take up Scott Cameron's sentiment, because I want to suggest, and it's really in the form of a hypothesis, that we may be at the cusp of a possible ecological civilization. So you'll note the modal language there, may and possible, indicating that this is something that is a possibility and depends on us, if you are so inspired, to try to make it an actuality or a reality. So I'm pushing sort of current environmental thinking towards the idea that we may be at the cusp of an ecological civilization. And the key text here, which I haven't mentioned specifically in this handout, but which was the announcement of the talk, is the text by Pope Francis called Laudato Si, the care of our common home. Because there, coming from a theology and biblical interpretation, and then extending those 2 foundations of biblical thought and the accounts in Genesis of the creation of the world and what kind of responsibility it lays on us, and likewise looking at the trends in the modern world, Pope Francis sort of lays out a program without, by the way, explicitly saying that his hope is for an ecological civilization. But if we had time, and we can certainly do that during the discussion, I think I can pull out enough texts in Laudato Si to indicate that, in fact, even if he was not specifically mentioning it, it's something that is very consonant with his thinking in Laudato Si. So that's the background, and now let me come to point number 2, and just very briefly talk about these 3 terms of my title. First, civilization. A civilization is a set of advanced developments in society, embracing culture, embracing technology, embracing forms of life that have a certain determinate character, all right? So that if one, for example, talks about Indian civilization, there are a set of ideas, certain patterns of living that are associated with that civilization. So the key idea that I want to pull out of calling it a civilization is a holistic idea that our economics, our politics, our technology will be reconfigured under this new gestalt, this new form of a possible civilization. Everything gets changed. And if you want, we could think of modern civilization as a parallel, because clearly our politics in terms of moving away from the reigns of monarchs and the authority of the church to a republican order goes together with the idea of individual autonomy, and that in turn goes together with the idea of a laissez-faire economics that in turn makes possible the market. So in a sense, the key structures of modern life in politics and economics hang together in a way that merits the term civilization. And the hope is that some of these developments in economics and politics and technology and culture might hang together as well in a new ecological civilization. The second point is one that is more familiar to you and that I'm not going to spend much time on. Ecological signifies the interactive patterns between individual organisms and their environment. And if you take that sort of key idea of interrelationship and the idea of parts and wholes, then you get the idea that there's not just the sort of natural ecology of geosystems and but also a social ecology, because there is also a way in which family life, community life, political life are interconnected, all right? And again, where there are some overarching ideas, all right? In our own case, it is the predominance of the market and the state, all right? And again, during discussion, we can see how these overarching ideas of the state and the market, to mention two ideas from modernity, in a sense give meaning to and parse, P-A-R-S-E, the sort of constituent elements. So that's the thrust of the word ecological, and I've already spent time in telling you why I've called it towards. That this indicates a certain direction, but this direction, as I say, is highly contingent as to what's going to happen. I'm certainly not in the business of predicting phenomena in a world of tremendous uncertainty. I don't need to spell that out, but it's a distinct possibility, all right? And it's that possibility that I want to lay before you in order to get us to think this afternoon in new ways. In other words, if the key idea of calling it holistic and civilizational is to give a set of overarching ideas which then reconfigure all the constituent elements, our task this afternoon will be to see what an ecological civilization might do, all right? So I do want to say very quickly that again, this is by no means a sort of novel enterprise. Many others have been doing this for some time, and for those of you who are interested, I've given here 3 precedents, if you want, of groups and individuals who have been thinking and working along similar lines. All right. By far the most consequential, besides Laudato Si, which only came out in 2015 and whose impact is still being felt. By contrast, the Earth Charter started its global discussions in the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, all right, and engaged in a global participatory process. And it is certainly, together with the UN Declaration on Human Rights, two of the most powerful and consequential modern statements, as I say. So, I mean, if you have some priorities for environmental thinking, I would say, and you haven't already done so, I would say certainly the Earth Charter and Laudato Si are well worth your attention. There is a project that I'm involved in, and I'm very glad to see from the notice there that John Cobb, who is certainly one of the great environmental thinkers of our time, was here just 2 days ago in the theology department. And John Cobb, and some of you whom I recognize from this remarkable conference, Deborah and Andre and John, at this conference in Claremont called Seizing an Alternative. That was the, and the alternative clearly is the ecological civilization. And that is still an ongoing project. I mean, some 2,000 people, including, and you'll be interested to hear this, 10 people from the Chinese Politburo, because of course the environmental sort of repercussions of environmental policy in a rapidly expanding China are clearly enormous. And unlike many in our own government, the Chinese government is far-seeing enough to send 10 people from its central Politburo to come to Claremont in June of 2015 to attend this conference. And so that's the second. And the third is the Parliament of the World's Religions, with which I am associated, which in its last parliament in Salt Lake City in Utah came up with a declaration on climate change. And I'll just read the last words of that declaration. The future we embrace will be a new ecological civilization and a world of peace, justice, and sustainability with the flourishing of the diversity of life. We will build this future as one human family within the greater Earth community. Right? And again, the Parliament was attended by some 9,000 people from around the world. So you can see from the Earth Charter, from the impact of Laudato Si, that this is in the air. All right, and I am by no means a lone voice talking about such things. So having said that, let me, in the course of the next half an hour or so, lay out some building blocks for this ecological civilization. And as you can see from the handout, I've divided my remarks into sort of 4 parts: historical, philosophical, methodological, and then economic. All right. Obviously, I could have, in line with what I've just said, vastly expanded the number of categories. I could certainly have spoken about political developments, certainly spoken about technological developments, but in the space of a short talk where I may already be stretching myself into dilettantism, I have to be selective. So let me start with the first category, of the historical. As I said, we have emerged from this period of modernity, and at least for philosophers like myself and Brian, who sort of want to provide some kind of name for our present configuration. It's sort of called postmodernity, but it's largely a vacuous term, because what the commitments are of postmodernity, other than with Lyotard the sort of breakdown of large meta-narratives and so on, is not entirely clear. The only thing that is sort of reasonably clear is that we have, at least in some parts of our social and political life, moved past modernity, and what new configuration will take is, so in a sense you can understand postmodernity as a kind of marker, sort of marking time till something more clear emerges on the horizon. But among the many shortcomings, I'm going to mention two which are related. All right. One is that, especially in light of what I want to say in the philosophical remarks, and which, to give you a sort of foretaste, has to do with saying that, at least speaking very broadly, there are sort of three vectors, three dimensions of life whose interactions need to be sort of carefully thought out. One is the place of humans in nature and the world, all right. The second has to do with the idea that there may be a divine presence sort of permeating our human life, sometimes called in Western tradition providence, in the Indian tradition karma, but that nonetheless there is this divine substratum, divine accompaniment, if you want, to human life. And the third is, of course, the obvious fact, which has now become more obvious, that we live in nature, that our human history, which is barely 8,000 years old, fits in a much longer history of the cosmos, which is 15 billion years old, all right, and how those two histories are related, sometimes called deep history, is, of course, a very interesting question. For those of you interested in that particular question, certainly a book that is interesting is by the Israeli historian Joshua Harari, called Homo sapiens, and where Harari looks at this. But there are others as well, some of which are probably familiar to people in the theology department here, coming from the work of Father Thomas Berry, called The Universe Story, Berry and Brian Swim. So there is that triad, if you want, of the human, divine, and cosmos. And what happened in modernity, in my reading, is that the human got sort of lifted up and made, if you want, the Hamlet of the whole story, without too many Horatios around, all right. And as a result, again, to cut short and short circuit a very long development, which we can certainly discuss during the discussion period, humans had this idea that being the masters of all creation, the top of the heap in the divine creation, that again, with a false reading of Genesis, that they were given charge to dominate and control the earth, all right. This is a false reading of Genesis, and even a great historian like Lynn White, who blames Christianity and for our ecological crisis, engages in this particular reading of that Genesis text. I'm glad to say that Pope Francis has a far more nuanced reading, because there are two accounts in genesis, and the second account is far less oriented towards domination and control than the first account. But in any case, to come back to the historical point, you had an exaggerated anthropocentrism, all right, to the neglect and domination of nature, and I would argue, but not today, that a certain distorting of the divine dimension that was again seen in the human image, all right, and again, the thinker here who with unerring accuracy put his finger on the problem was the German philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach, who said that much of our theology was really disguised anthropology, all right, that in a sense we were projecting our human desires and impulses onto something that we called divine, and if that story is true, then Feuerbach, and then following him, Marx's challenge was to say, well, if we project these wishes and desires, why don't we simply recover them, all right? And in a sense, that was the program of Marx and the left Hegelians, all right? Okay, so that's one aspect of this. But I want to point out also, and this is something that I was talking with Brian, the discipline of cosmology, which in the medieval period is a central discipline. I mean, you can't understand Dante or any of the works of theology without seeing that theology and cosmology, and to some extent philosophy and cosmology, go very closely together. Cosmology got, in the modern period, made into an abstract science where, obviously with the help of telescopes and modern instruments, one acquired a great deal of scientific knowledge. But what the impact of that knowledge was on human beings and on the central question of cosmology, which is the question that Scott Cameron is posing there, what is our human place in nature? What is our human history of 8,000 years? How is that to be understood within the larger history of 15 billion years? Those were central cosmological questions for someone like Dante, all right? And when Dante erects his Purgatorio and his Inferno, etc., they're always woven into human destinies. As I say, that aspect of cosmology got completely dwarfed. A modern cosmologist in a science department, you can carry out the experiment yourself, wouldn't have the faintest idea when you'd say, are we a microcosm of the macrocosm? I mean, he'd look at you, or he or she would look at you with stupefaction because they wouldn't even understand the question. But on the other hand, in medieval cosmology, that is one of the sort of, what is the human purpose? That purpose is defined against nature and obviously permeating both nature and the human, the divine, all right? So two markers of the historical period, just to summarize and to move on. One, an exaggerated anthropocentrism, but again, it's very easy to see that this would have disastrous effects, because if you destroy and control your very habitat, your very home, you end up destroying and hurting yourself. And the repercussions of that in bad air, in the loss of biodiversity, in rising temperatures, etc., has become all too clear in our time. It's important, just again in passing, to say that nature is not just, when Scott talks about a living dialogue with nature, it's important to understand that nature is not, in that sense, an external environment. Nature is something that is part of who we are, all right? And in that sense, the dialogue is a living dialogue, because there are different expressions of nature. in human beings via our consciousness, but plants and animals have their own being, and how our human consciousness is connected with the being of plants and animals and oceans is in fact part of that living dialogue that is part of environmental thinking. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about the historical. I've already indicated the philosophical shortcomings of this, and there are 2 points here that I would like in the philosophical section, which is section number 6 there, that I would like to again put out very briefly and then expand during the Q&A. One is the idea that one of the sort of central aspects of a sort of philosophical reorientation that might serve as a building block for a ecological civilization is this idea of relationality, and what the Vietnamese monk with whom you are, many of whom may be familiar with, Thich Nhat Hanh, calls interbeing, right? Interbeing means that our being is constituted not as monads or as isolated individuals who then enter into partnership or collaboration with others. Our very being, who we are, is constituted by our being related to each other and to the environment. And you take away that relationality and you get an extremely artificial sort of product, all right? So that's one of the sort of key ideas that I think is worth keeping in mind. And for those of you who are theologians, anyone here, by the way, studies theology? All right, well, okay, so the Trinity, all right, is one of the key cardinal Christian doctrines, all right, and the Trinity is a relational Trinity, that these 3 persons, or called persons, or entities, or realities, called Father, Son, and Spirit, are intimately related to each other, all right, and that in a sense each of them would not be who they are without that relation, all right. So again, just to sort of spell it out very quickly, the Father is the source, but the source without its expressions, what it gives rise to, would really be a barren source, all right. And so the Father has to give rise to the Son as its expression, as its logos, all right. But this expression in turn would not be fulfilled unless there were a sharing of the love and the energy that is generated between Father and Son, and that is that reality that the Trinitarian theology captures by the idea of the Spirit. The Spirit is the communal expression of and again in Christian theology, that's the birth of the church through Pentecost and so on. But the lurking behind many of these doctrines is the Trinity and its Trinitarian relationality. And the last point very quickly is that just as you have the source and its expression in the Son, and the community that shares this love and energy generated between Father and Son, the community, this entire pattern loops back onto the Father, onto the source, all right? It's what the Greek fathers call perichoresis, which means the dance of energy, the dance of love, all right, in a kind of circular motion. Okay, so it's that idea that I want to in summary form, lift before you, because, as I said, it corrects this exaggerated anthropocentrism of modernity by giving a far greater profile to human consciousness. Not only are we in living dialogue with nature, but being also animated by the divine spirit, our consciousness extends beyond the 70 years of our earthly life, all right? And again, in the Christian tradition, we've just celebrated two very important feasts, the Feast of All Saints and the Feast of All Souls. Both of those feasts commemorate this idea that our human destinies are interlinked with the past, the present, and obviously the coming generations to come. So there's that point of the expansion of human consciousness. And one last point before I move on, and that is the what I've called the tempeternal, but this is to say that, again, our idea of time, because of how we tend to see time in biological or geological terms, does not capture the cosmological element that was so prominent in a poet like Dante, of saying that each moment of time is imprinted with eternity. If you go really deep, there is an eternal dimension, all right? And Plato gets this right when he calls time the moving image of eternity. Time lived to its fullest opens up into an eternal dimension. And my suggestion is that getting back this fundamental Trinitarian relationality of ours might allow us to capture some of this lost tempeternal dimension. Let me move to 7. So we've already covered in the historical period the exaggerated anthropocentrism. In the philosophical section, I've suggested a possible antidote, the revival of relationality and interbeing. And this means that our thinking, if we want to think ecologically, has to be holistic, all right, where again we deal with the whole and the relation of the parts to the whole, all right. That's part of the definition of ecological. But not only does it have to be holistic, it also has to be systemic, all right, that the earth is a system, social life is a system where things are interconnected. So I'll be brief here because I'm running out of time. The two important ideas that hang together with the historical and philosophical comments are what I'm calling here methodological holism and the systems thinking. But this is a very radical suggestion because American life, for all its strengths, is, I would venture to say, I mean, and this is again where cross-cultural philosophy comes in, is a highly individualistic culture. The great culture heroes, Emerson and Thoreau, self-reliance and so on, are thinkers who want to pull away from the crowd. I mean, in Thoreau's case, of course, there's still the dialogue with nature, but if you read Emerson's essays, all right, you'll see that here is the great champion of individualism. And I'll just give you a sort of sinister example of how destructive that individual, there are many things to be said, obviously, on the other side, but just consider this example, all right? Consider how the American commerce is able to sort of keep going, right? It's the idea of saying, look, you have to have this car or this product if you want to be better than so-and-so, all right? You are not really fulfilled as an individual if you are not competing with and not outdoing another individual, all right? So it's the idea of saying that as an isolated individual, all right, and there's no idea here that your community is going to help you to buy the car. I mean, the American company will finance you, et cetera, even if it means perpetual indebtedness. But certainly the idea is that you are inadequate as an individual unless you have this product or that product, et cetera, all right? And you can see how subtly this seemingly abstract doctrine seeps into social and commercial life. So the idea with the antidote of a more communitarian, a more relational aspect is that some of these competitive, Hobbesian kinds of tendencies will be somewhat mitigated, and one would have a more healthy communitarian life than we at present enjoy in the United States, at any rate. This tendency, and I'm now coming to my last point, is most pronounced in the discipline of economics, all right? Because it's one of the, I mean, and I say this as a professional economist who, as Brian mentioned, studied with Amartya Sen and then taught economics at the Delhi School of Economics before turning renegade, as it were. But economics, from the time of Adam Smith to perhaps the greatest economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, was always seen as a moral science. When Keynes studied and taught economics in Cambridge till 1946, when he died, it was as part of a triad of psychology, ethics, and economics. And so it shouldn't surprise you at all if, for those of you who are students of philosophy, that philosophers like G.E. Moore and Keynes himself, who did a lot of work on probability and on other aspects of philosophy, Frank Ramsey, another great thinker of that time, these were all people sort of trained in this. So Frank Ramsey, who was a great mathematician, had contributions in philosophy and in economics. So I think you sort of get the point so the question is, what happened to this discipline that made it now part of the natural sciences? And I don't know if there's any economist here, but you open an economics journal and 90% of the text is mathematics, all right? So it's become a branch of applied mathematics, all right? And the emphasis on quantity rather than quality. So the idea is that when you have an ethos, when you have an environment sparked by modernity, which is utilitarian, which is exploitative and controlling, all right, the disciplines mirror that gestalt, mirror that aspect. And there is no better example. There may be others, but certainly economics is a very eloquent example. Consider the, and with that, of course, as I pointed out in the handout, is the fact that economics is now seen not only as a natural science, but with that becomes the idea that the important thing in life is to get rich and to make as much money, and those countries are sort of prospering that make a lot of money. My own teacher, Amartya Sen, did a very interesting empirical study where he took two populations, one in Detroit, Michigan, and the other in Kerala, India, and measured them in terms of what you would generally call welfare, all right? And the population in Detroit had 10 times as more money per income, per capita than the population in Kerala, India. But in terms of health, community flourishing, morbidity rates, suicide rates, all of which he studied, Kerala was far superior to the much monetarily rich population in Detroit. It's a classic study which Sen did. And of course, it had the idea of how one then measures the wealth of a society. All right. And again, for those of you who might be interested in this, it's a complex discussion that has gone on for many years as to how one measures the gross domestic product, which is one of the markers. But here is, as an antidote, John Ruskin, one of the great minds of the Victorian period, who was also an economist and greatly influenced Gandhi. This is from his book, Unto This Last, which Gandhi translated into Gujarati. So deep was the influence of Ruskin on Gandhi. Here is Ruskin, who has also studied political economy. He was a sort of polymath. There is no wealth, this is Ruskin, there is no wealth but life. Life, including all its powers of love, of joy, and of admiration. That country is richest, which nourishes the greatest number of noble and happy human beings. Please note the word noble. One hardly uses that word even in moral philosophy. Leave aside economics. I think the last time economics saw the word noble in its literature was indeed with Ruskin 120 years ago. That man is richest, please note the term richest, who, having perfected the functions of his own life to the utmost, has also the widest helpful influence, both personal and by means of his possession, over the lives of others, right? So you'd see in this quote of Ruskin at least 3 or 4 of the themes that I have been championing, all right? One is this idea of life seen holistically, all right? Life seen in terms of its essential human attributes of joy, of love, admiration, and so on, right? Richness and wealth being seen in the perfection of our powers rather than in our bank accounts and in the money that we have. And where the purpose of life is not just to be happy unto ourselves, but to share this happiness, the helpful influence that Ruskin emphasizes as being important is, as I say, a marked difference and a marked departure from the way in which economics sort of subsequently went. So it's time to wrap up and have our time for discussion. But I hope that with this example of economics and some of the other ideas that I've all too briefly and perhaps overly fast sort of gone over, you get some idea of the building blocks of an ecological civilization. And as part of that civilization, the emphasis is certainly relationality being expressed through dialogue, and that's what we're going to have right now. So thank you very much for your attention. And now let's do the most interesting part, which is our dialogue. Yeah. Yeah. So, Brian, you can start. Yeah.
So I'm interested in the toward because a lot of your examples refer back to pre-modern examples of community, pre-modern examples of cosmology and things like this. So I'm wondering to what extent you're committed to toward an ecological civilization as opposed to return to an ecological.
That's a brilliant question. No, I'm not turning the clock back because certain achievements of modernity have to be preserved. Achievements like human rights, individual dignity, the idea that the authority of the church and the authority of the state cannot disturb, some of the great achievements of the Magna Carta and so on. So it's the idea of saying, in a nutshell, how does one preserve the gains of modernity and avoid some of its worst effects into building something that is, if you want, recuperative but also forward-looking, and hence the towards. So let me give you an example. So clearly, with this exaggerated anthropocentrism, there is a knowledge of sort of human powers, all right, that we acknowledge, right? And those powers, I would say, need to be both, and this is a bit of a juggling act, both celebrated, but also hemmed in and brought into dialogue with nature and with the divine. So let's take a specific example, all right, from social life, death, right? Death is, in modern American life, a dreadful development which we now clinicalize, all right, so that from the generation of your parents and my parents certainly, who would have made it almost a point of faith to die at home surrounded by family and so on, all right. Now it's being given over to hospitals, to sort of clinical facilities. Even worse, all right, the aspect of death, of saying that, which I was hinting at before, that when we die, much of what we have worked with and continues on through generations in the communion of saints, if you want, all right. So the idea of seeing, a definite biological limit to human powers, if you have the isolated anthropological picture of modernity, death begins to look like a disaster because it's the end of the adventure. But if you see it as part of a cosmic destiny that continues through generations, that without getting terribly mystical or poetic, still has its impact on the environment where nothing really is lost, then the idea that we have lived our life and are ready to sort of pass on, has a different valence, has a different sort of feel about it. So I'm offering that as an example of saying that certainly I would not want to go back, because I certainly don't want the autocracies of church and of state, though of course the market is not necessarily a great improvement, but nonetheless I certainly want those freedoms, but those freedoms in community, in relationship. Whereas much of the pre-modern communities were very much under the aegis of, in feudal society, the community was ruled by the nobles and the feudal lords, and likewise many of the sort of medieval communities were under the authority of the church. So communities that could form with human beings, as in, let's say, ecological communities where you have your own agriculture, you grow your own crops and so on and so forth. These are new communities that are going to be formed and not sort of backward looking. I don't know if you want to press the point. Yeah. Yeah, please, by all means. That's the whole point.
Yeah, first of all, I really enjoyed this. This is a fantastic talk. It really helped me to understand more deeply some of the things that I've been thinking about, and some of the things I try to teach my students. So thank you.
And what students are these?
I'm actually teaching business students.
Oh, okay.
In a capstone business and society.
Okay.
Environmental business class. You say you don't want to go back because you don't want to go back to feudalism and these sorts of things. What if that's not going back far enough? You said twice in the talk that our human history is 8,000 years compared to the 15 billion of the universe. But our human history is in fact 2 million years as genus Homo and 200,000 years as Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
200,000 years.
I meant 8,000 years of sort of recorded history.
Right.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so 200,000 years during which we lived in exactly the way you're describing, as part of nature, in interrelated communities, tribes, right?
Mhm.
Tribally in ways that worked for humans and our surrounding environments for 200,000 years, right? It's only
Yeah.
the last 10,000 since,
Right.
since the agricultural revolution that we've started down this path that leads to where we are now.
Right.
So maybe in looking back, it's not looking back to pre-industrial times, but pre-agricultural times.
Mm-hmm.
Is that
No, that's a very good point. And again, it's important when we do civilizational work to go through the swath of history, and as you are quite rightly suggesting, not just the last 300 or 400 years. So if we look at sort of tribal history, if you want, which is again, you're right that the the question is, what did they have which we don't, and conversely, what do they not have which we might possibly be enjoying? So, in answer to the first question, what do they have? There's certainly, as you're suggesting, a far greater sense of social cohesion, that either because of protection of the tribe from other warring tribes or from animals, etc., they had to sort of group together. But what they didn't have compared to sort of modern communities is the free expression of the individual, because the imperatives of survival and of staying together as a community were so strong that there was no question of leaving much scope for individual expression and initiative. All right. So take an example again. I mean, this is not exactly from a tribal society, but a very specific example from one of my Chinese students who said something arose in class where a student said, well, this is my sort of private diary, and I was furious with my mom for opening my private diary. And the Chinese student said, what are you talking about? In China, at least where I grew up, the Chinese student said, because she had come, it happens all the time. I mean, our parents open our letters, and if they are, there's something there that is destructive of family, all right, they will promptly, scold us, all right. And that, by the way, was in broad terms, the rationale for Tiananmen Square, right? The rationale that the Chinese government gave was that the students protesting for their rights were destroying the sort of social bonds of Chinese society, and the state could not allow that, and so they had to sort of send their tanks in. But it's the same idea that, again, you see in highly collective societies. And I think that much of tribal life had that kind of ethos where the bosses or the sort of elders simply lay down the law, and the tribe had to sort of go along. So that's it's a balance, absolutely, because we have gone to the other extreme, where, in a sense, our individual initiative has destroyed much of our sense of community. Consider a feast that is coming right now, all right, Thanksgiving, all right. It used to be the case, and again, even in American life, the Sunday dinner was a family ritual where, whatever the attraction of the Lakers, and sorry to say the Dodgers have no attractive power anymore, but nonetheless, that was a sort of important ritual that brought the family together. Wherever your individual pursuits were taken, you at Sunday dinner, and even more over Thanksgiving. All right, this was a time when we'd sort of share our impressions, our memories, and bond as a family. And now, because of the imperatives of work and because of the imperatives of other communities, etc., that's pretty much a toss of the coin. We don't know whether it's going to happen or not. So the point that I'm trying to advocate is, and that's why that also makes it tentative, because there is definitely a tension between you take individual initiative too far, a la Emerson, and you really ended up sort of destroying much of community life. You take community life too far, as in certain tribal or feudal societies, and the individual suffocates. All right, and certainly the worst example of that is the communist regimes of our own time, where you've had hardly any individual expression, and then as soon as those regimes get toppled, as in Russia, the church that was suppressed for some 90 years, or just erupts. I mean, and today in Russia, without question, the sort of strongest cultural influence is this long suppressed Russian Orthodox Church, to which I won't go there. But in any case, so you see what I'm saying, that it's we learn from the past, but recognize that there are sort of new developments, and the question. But what I'm sort of suggesting is that, which also gives it an experimental character. We haven't as yet formed these communities where religious life is welded into. I mean, I'll take an example from religion. All right. So, as you probably know, and the Pew Foundation has studied this for over a longitudinal study for some 15 years now, the demographic of people from 16 to 38, all right, the so-called millennials, fall into one of two camps. All right, either they say, or maybe three camps. All right, that they are spiritual but not religious. All right, and want to make a big point about that. A smaller group says they're spiritual and religious. All right, and a fairly large group says they're neither spiritual nor religious. All right, so the idea, again, this is going to be too long into how this came about, etc. But basically, what I'm suggesting is that this divorce of spirituality from religion is a highly individualistic one, that you're not going to find too many communities. All right, I mean, these are people on their yoga mats and in their sort of private meditation spaces who say, "No, I want to access the cosmos through my meditation, etc." And of course, some of those are sort of social settings, but they're not communities. A yoga class is not in itself a community. It's just a collection of individuals doing their exercises together. All right. So this idea that you can and you get the same tension there, because one of the things that is driving people away from religious life is precisely its highly authoritarian, which of course is then abused in the child abuse scandal and so on, of the sort of authoritarian impulse that forms the religious life, which the young people quite sensibly don't want to have anything to do with. So the question becomes, and to some extent, this divorce of spirituality from religion is is an untenable one, because you can't for the long term get the sustaining power of a tradition, and because a tradition by its very definition means that which is carried forward from the Latin traditio. So if there's no tradition and it's here today, gone tomorrow, then you're not really going to have any community life. So I'm suggesting that as an example where the individualism of present day life, all right, has limited the possibilities of sort of meaningful, non-coercive, non-authoritarian communities. Well, it's very hard to choose between husband and wife. So I know you are individuals. So yeah.
If I'm understanding you correctly, on one hand, you're saying that tribal identity has quenched the individual flourishing. An overly overtly individualistic society ends up with global warming threatening our existence.
It's not that quick, but along those lines, yeah.
So what I'm getting that you're suggesting is that we employ the Trinity as a lens through which to understand our relationship to each other,
Mm-hmm.
our relationship to nature,
Mm-hmm.
and our relationship to the divine.
Mm-hmm.
How does one, this is a very strange question, but the problem seems to be in the way that we define ourselves. Because how we define ourselves also creates the possibility for either creating a wider community of belonging or creating a more specialized community of self-interest,
Mm-hmm.
which closes off wider community. I think as a society, the more we can understand that our destiny is aligned with the destiny of every other living system on this planet, and the more our individual survival is based on the promotion of the survival of everything else,
Mm-hmm.
the more realistic this wider global community becomes. So my question, I suppose, is how does one promote a really radical new idea of who we are in the face of global annihilation?
And the global annihilation comes from where?
Systems collapse, global warming.
Yeah, well, I mean, thank you. That's a brilliant and a really difficult question to answer, because my friend John Cobb, for example, is highly pessimistic and thinks that certain environmental damages which are irreversible, I mean, climate change and the ocean, rising and so on, whose impact we've already felt just these last year or so, and is only going to get worse, that obviously the world that we and our children are going to occupy is without question, let's be candid about that, a very dire world, and the pipe dreams of technologists who think that they might be able to sort of stem this is, if you want, a sort of false Prometheanism that really needs to be checked, as in fact Laudato Si, quite correctly does it. So I'm mindful of that because in situations like Katrina and Hurricane Harvey and so on, where you are living under sort of dire environmental conditions, clearly the formation of communities that are able to, in Ruskin's terms, be communities of joy and of love and of admiration, are severely compromised. So the hope is, and it's no more than a hope, that one, in a sense, tries to build this civilization in the very short margin of time that we have. And I have to say that the signs are not particularly bright or hopeful. This man is Irish and is a congenital pessimist, but I'm not, and even without that disadvantage, I'm not hopeful. So your question is a good one. So toward, as I was trying to emphasize, by no means indicates automaticity or something that is going to happen. As I keep emphasizing, and I perhaps should have emphasized even more, it very much depends on people like us sort of spreading the message, as you very well put it, that our destiny is tied up with the destiny of every sort of living creature, and that unless we sort of realize that kinship and have that true living dialogue with nature, we are in sort of deep trouble. But what I'm saying is that the dialogue has not taken place because of the sort of mentality that we have, where we think we can sort of go it alone, and technology is another example of that, of saying our human technology can conquer the loss of species, the loss of etc. Yeah. Deb, you had a question?
It was a slightly different
It's fine.
So it seems to me that a lot of the overview that we're considering with you, Joseph, is mostly on Western civilization, and I think we're all very aware of the tribalism, sort of mapping it up, historically tribalism as to how it's evolved today. And there's two things I want to say, is what do indigenous communities have to offer us in their aspects towards this new civilization? And I do want to add, from my perspective, and certainly working with and relating in many ways to the SBNR or the SB&R movement, and that I do believe they have community. I don't believe they are individualists. I think they do have religion. And I think they would say, the yoga people, most of them that I know, that their religion is love. And they have built community around that. And we see it manifesting on Facebook very, very beautifully, actually, even though there is an anonymity at a certain level, but on an energetic level, let's say, there definitely is this community that has swelled. And I would say you see at a lot of these festivals, and I think there might be a certain narcissism attached to it, I do agree, but there is certainly a bonding of support, and support is an aspect of community.
Sure.
So I think we do have to kind of acknowledge that is...
Well, that's a very interesting question, and again, I have no special sort of insight in this. My own sense, which is certainly highly disputable, is that these Facebook communities are not communities in the thick sense that I understand community. Because, look, I mean, there's even a degradation of language, all right? Take an expression like friend, all right? So you've exchanged a few sort of emails with someone on Facebook, admired someone's poem, and you're a friend. Come on, I mean, the depth of friendship. I mean, Aristotle spends 3 books of his ethics defining different kinds of friendship and what is involved in being a friend through thick and thin, and so my sense, but as I said, I'm not the person to ask because, as you know, Facebook is not one of my sort of domains. Deborah has to educate me in the simplest things on Facebook, but it's partly a sense that there's no deep bonding, and I think you can see that. I mean, what you share with Serena and Jared is not a Facebook community. You share the real love of a family, which has been through much together, shared joys, shared hardships, and so on and so forth. And it's that sense that sort of binds you together as a family, all right? I'd be obviously we can't carry out the experiment, but as I mentioned, death, I'd be very curious to know how, if two Facebook friends would actually fly across the country to be with someone by their bedside as they were dying, whether they have that kind of loyalty, whether they have that kind of commitment.
But you do see a tremendous amount of support, like for people dying on Facebook, very specifically, people who are isolated, people who are lonely, who do reach out, and the community that tap in that moment in time, that pick up that message, are there to be with them. Maybe they can't be physical in the traditional sense, and maybe it's not optimal in a sense that you're referring to in terms of this deep love bond that we share as family or we share as friends. But it certainly is better than nothing if you're isolated and lonely or you need advice. And there is, I'm just saying, don't let's throw the baby out with the bathwater, because there is absolutely a current present there that I do believe is genuine. I'm not supporting it and promoting it, but
Yeah.
it is there and it needs to be.
No, you may well be right. As I say, I speak in ignorance because I simply haven't, sort of gone there, and so I'm in no.
People an opportunity also to exercise their voice.
Mm-hmm.
People who are lonely, who don't have friends,
Mm-hmm.
suddenly have an opportunity to find out a little bit more about how they contribute to a conversation, albeit virtual.
Yeah.
There are some positive aspects.
No, I mean, sure. I mean, look,
I'm stating the obvious, but
I'm not going to deny that virtual communities could be communities, but they are certainly, I would say, communities of a different kind, and certainly not a substitute, because in a sense the bedrock of sort of community life, all right, is again, it's a bit of a stretch, but Brian and I were talking over lunch over the fact that when we were sort of blindsided by the sort of disaster of Trump, there was no political community that could organize an organized opposition to it. Again, that may be a far-fetched example, but certainly it's difficult to see, if you take sort of other episodes of American history, that a strong sort of labor and trade union movement, if it had continued to exist, would not have been far more vocal than it has been at the moment. It's because we've really scattered and don't really have, we have remnants and bits and pieces here, but those are not sort of strong enough to be able to organize.
We have an example in our community
Yeah.
of a leader from the indigenous tribes of the Amazon coming to America, gaining support through the UN to build a community of indigenous activists replanting the rainforest. And that is a very clear example of the way indigenous tribes can be leaders,
Mm-hmm.
or at least be examples for us to follow.
Yeah.
So I was interested in that aspect of Deborah's question.
No, I mean, that is a very valuable point. The fact is that, again, under the sort of glamour of modernity, our response to indigenous tribes is condescending, is basically, at best, a kind of is largely sort of stilted, So I wouldn't for a moment doubt that, in line with my argument, that here are streams from whom we can learn without romanticizing them, all right, who have a deep wisdom to teach us if we are sort of willing to learn. But that requires us to unlearn certain habits so that we can be, on the one hand, humble and open enough, and on the other hand, sort of candid enough to say, look, does this sort of really help us? That conversation is badly needed, and as I say, because again of the impact of modernity, we just tend to push this aside because these are a non-modern or a pre-modern people, and therefore have sort of nothing to teach us, and that's or is definitely a form of colonialism. Yeah.
Maybe we should continue the conversation around food because I know there's a couple of people that have to leave. So if you could join me in thanking Tom.
Well, thank you.
We can continue.